My name is Natalie Greer. I'm 32 years old, and until about 8 months ago, I thought I had a pretty good handle on what my life looked like. Not perfect, but mine. Then my husband walked out the door with a single suitcase and the phone number of a woman whose father owned half the commercial real estate in Nashville. He didn't even tell me to my face. He texted me from a hotel downtown. 11 years, one son, one mortgage, and I got a text. Within 3 weeks, I was sleeping on the couch because I couldn't afford to keep the apartment we'd rented together. The lease was in both our names, but he'd already stopped contributing to rent, and Tennessee is not the kind of state that moves quickly on emergency support orders. My attorney told me to be patient. My bank account did not have that luxury. My son Eli was 7. He had a gap in his front teeth and an obsession with dinosaurs and absolutely no idea why daddy wasn't coming home. I told him daddy was working somewhere else for a while. I don't know if he believed me. Kids that age see more than we give them credit for. My mother offered to take Eli while I got back on my feet. She lives 40 minutes south of us in Franklin, and she has a small house with a yard, and Eli loves her more than anything. It broke my heart to say yes, but I said yes anyway. That's the part nobody tells you about being a broke single mom. Sometimes love means handing your kid to someone else so you can go fight for him. I sent him with his backpack and his stuffed triceratops, and I cried in my car for 20 minutes before I pulled out of her driveway. Then I started applying for jobs. I had a background in home health care from before Eli was born. I'd worked as a certified nursing assistant for 2 years before switching to a desk job at a medical billing company when we got married. My husband had wanted me closer to home, more available, less unpredictable hours. I'd agreed because I loved him. Now I had a rusty CNA certification, $300 in checking, and a stack of overdue bills rubber banded together on the kitchen counter. That's when I found the listing. It was posted on a private job board, not one of the regular sites. A full-time live-in caregiver position. Private estate in Brentwood. The posting said the patient was an elderly man with significant behavioral challenges and a history of aggressive episodes. High compensation, private quarters provided, meals included. Most people, I think, would have scrolled past it. The phrase aggressive episodes is not exactly a selling point, but I did the math in about 4 seconds flat. Live-in meant no rent. High compensation meant I could catch up on what I owed and start saving something real. And I needed to be working yesterday. I applied that night. 2 days later, I was standing at a wrought iron gate at the end of a long private driveway in Brentwood, staring at a house that looked more like a boutique hotel than someone's home. Red brick, white columns, 3 stories, ivy crawling up the east side. The kind of house you slow down to look at when you're driving by. A woman answered the door. She was maybe 40, dressed in cream linen, hair pulled back, smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You must be Natalie," she said. I nodded. "That's me. I'm Renee Alderman. Theodore is my father." She stepped aside to let me in. "I want to be honest with you before we get started. His condition is difficult." I asked her how difficult. "Most caregivers last less than a week," she said, like she was talking about a high turnover rate at a call center, not a human being in her care. "He becomes agitated without much warning. He throws things sometimes. He's hit a staff member before, though he didn't cause serious injury." She said all of this while walking me through a wide marble hallway, her heels clicking on the floor, not once looking back to gauge my reaction. I thought about Eli's dinosaur backpack sitting in my mother's hall closet. I thought about the power bill I owed. "I can handle it," I said. She glanced back then, just briefly. "B and C?" She took me to his room on the main floor. Large windows looking out onto a garden, afternoon light coming through in long, pale strips. An old man sat in a wing-back chair near the window, turned slightly away from the door. His hair was white and needed a trim. His hands were resting on his knees, and even from across the room I could see the tremor in his fingers. The moment Renee opened the door wider, he turned. "Who is that?" he said sharply. "This is your new caregiver, Dad. Her name is Natalie." "I don't want a new one." He said it the way you'd say you didn't want a new brand of coffee. Flat, final, send her away. Renee sighed the way you sigh at something you've explained too many times. She ran through the basics of his daily schedule with me, pointed out his medication organizer on the dresser, showed me where the call button was, and then she left. She actually just left. Turned around and walked out and left me alone in the room with the man who had just told her to send me away. He glared at me. I pulled a chair to a reasonable distance. Not too close, not so far it seemed like I was afraid of him. And I sat down. Mr. Alderman, I said, I'm not going anywhere, but I'm not going to bother you either. I'm just going to sit here. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned back to the window. That was day one. My room was on the second floor. Small, clean, a single window that faced the side garden. It wasn't much, but it was more than I had. I called my mother that first night and she put Eli on the phone and he told me he'd found a roly-poly bug in her backyard and named it Gerald, and I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. After I hung up, I went downstairs to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The house was quiet. It was past 9 and the staff had all gone to their respective corners for the night. I walked through the main hallway, turned toward the kitchen, and then I stopped. There was a light on in the sitting room of the foyer, and there were voices. One voice in particular. I knew that voice. My stomach dropped before my brain even caught up. I stepped into the doorway, and there he was, leaning against the wet bar with a lowball glass in his hand, laughing at something on his phone. He looked up when he heard me, and for a moment neither of us moved. It was my ex-husband, Derek. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing that hit me first, stupidly. He looked completely unchanged, relaxed, comfortable, like he belonged in that room, and I was standing there in my second-day jeans, holding a water glass I hadn't even filled yet. He smiled slowly. Well, he said, this is unexpected. I couldn't find words for a second. My mouth was open and nothing was coming out. So this is what you're doing now, he said, looking me over. Not cruel exactly. More like curious in a way that still managed to sting. You're working here? I'm the live-in caregiver, I said, because it was the only sentence I had. He tilted his head slightly, for Renee's father. He took a sip of his drink. You know that makes you an employee in my house. Something went cold in my chest. Your house? Renee and I got married 6 weeks ago. He said it easily, casually, like he was telling me about a car he'd bought. We've been living here since March. He set the glass down and looked at me with something I can only describe as enjoyment. Not loud, quiet, worse. Does that make things awkward for you? I wanted to say something sharp. I wanted to say something that would land. But I looked at him standing there in a house that wasn't his, wearing a life that wasn't his either. And I thought about Eli asking me last week if Daddy missed him, and I made myself breathe. Good night, Derek, I said. I turned around and walked back upstairs without the water. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling and did the math over and over. If I quit, I had nothing. If I stayed, I had to watch my ex-husband walk through those halls every day, making little comments, wearing that smile. But Eli had school in the fall. His backpack was already starting to fall apart. My mother wasn't young and she was doing me an enormous favor, and I couldn't ask her to keep doing it indefinitely. I had to stay. The next morning, I went back to work. Mr. Alderman was already awake when I arrived. He looked at me like he was slightly annoyed I'd come back. You again, he said. Me again, I said. He pointed at the window. Open that. It's stuffy. I opened the window. It was a small thing, but it was the first thing he'd asked me to do that wasn't leave. The days that followed were hard, but not impossible. He threw a remote control on day 3. On day 4, he knocked over a water pitcher. On day 5, he called me 4 different names, none of them mine, and yelled at me to get out of his house. I picked up the things he threw and refilled the things he knocked over, and stayed in the room and spoke calmly when he spoke loudly. I didn't try to force anything. I just kept showing up. Derek, meanwhile, was finding his rhythms in the house. He had a way of appearing in doorways right when I was walking past, commenting just loud enough for me to hear. Once he was on the phone with someone and he laughed and said, "No, she literally takes care of him, that's her job," and then glanced over at me to make sure I'd heard. I had. I kept walking. Another morning, he was having coffee in the kitchen when I came in, and he said, without looking up from his phone, Renee thinks you're doing well, by the way. She says he seems less agitated. I poured my coffee and didn't answer. You should be grateful, he said. It's a good position. Stable. Suits you. I left the kitchen. About 2 weeks in, something changed with Mr. Alderman's condition. Renee brought in two men I hadn't seen before. She introduced them as specialists, though she didn't specify what kind. They went into his room with a small black case and they were in there for close to 45 minutes while I waited in the hall. When they came out, they didn't speak to me. Renee thanked them at the door and they left. When I went back into his room, he was different. Not worse in the way you'd expect after a medical visit, not quieter or more tired. He was agitated in a raw, scattered way. His hands were shaking harder than usual, and his eyes kept moving around the room like he was looking for something he couldn't name. He knocked over his glass before I could even get close to the table. He shouted at the wall. He grabbed a framed photo from the nightstand, and I only barely caught it before it hit the floor. It took over an hour to get him calm enough to sit. I kept thinking about the 2 weeks before that appointment, how he'd started to settle, how he'd started calling me by the right name, how he'd let me hand him his coffee instead of putting it on the table and stepping away. All of that seemed to have reset. Something was wrong. I didn't know what yet, but something was wrong. That night, I was passing the study on my way to the kitchen. The door was open an inch or two, and I could hear Renee's voice clearly. And Derek's. I should have kept walking, I know that, but the words caught me before my feet could. The adjustment is working, Renee said. Her voice was level, like she was talking about a business update. How much longer do we need? Derek asked. Probably another month. 2 at the most. Once his behavior is documented over a consistent period, the legal process is simple. And the estate? All of it? Everything, she said. Once a court agrees he is legally incapacitated, I become the sole administrator. The trust, the properties, the investment accounts, everything my stepbrother thinks he's inheriting goes back to me. Derek made a sound that I recognized. That low, satisfied sound he made when something was going his way. He just has to keep getting worse, he said. He will, Renee said. He will. I stood in the hallway for I don't know how long after that. My heart was going very fast. My palms were pressed flat against the wall and I was counting my breathing without meaning to, which is something I do when I need to keep from reacting out loud. They were drugging him, or adjusting his medication in some deliberate way, making him appear worse than he actually was, so that a court would declare him incompetent, so Renee could take control of everything before he had the chance to change his will. That was what the two men with the black case were doing. The next morning, I went in early. He was sitting in the chair by the window, quieter than usual, which lately meant something had been done to him the day before, and he was still foggy from it. I sat down across from him and just waited. After a few minutes, he turned and looked at me. Really looked, not the scattered, unfocused look from the day before. You heard something, he said. I went very still. What makes you say that? He tilted his head slightly. Because you're looking at me the way people look at someone they've decided to feel sorry for. His voice was dry. Not unkind. I've been a businessman for 50 years, I know that look. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, How long have you known? He was quiet. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere on the property. The sound of it came and went in the distance. I suspected for about 3 months, he said finally. There are days when I'm completely clear. And there are days when I can't hold a sentence together. And I know my own mind well enough to know the difference. He looked down at his hands. But when you're an old man in a wheelchair and your daughter brings in doctors who say you're deteriorating, nobody asks what you think. I told him what I'd heard. All of it. I sat there and I told him, and I watched his face go through something quiet and painful, and then settle into something harder. My son-in-law, he said. The word came out flat. That man has been in this house for 2 months, and he already knows what he wants out of it. What do you want to do? I asked. He looked at me. For a long moment, he just looked at me. I want to fight back, he said. But I can't do it alone. And everyone in this house is either on her payroll or afraid of her. He paused. Except you. I'm on her payroll too, I said. He almost smiled. Yes, but you have a reason not to be loyal to her. He wasn't wrong. We were careful. We had to be. I still showed up every day and did my job. And Mr. Alderman still had his episodes, or appeared to, whenever Renee was around. That part came naturally to him. He had decades of negotiation behind him, and he understood that showing your hand too early ends the game. What changed was what happened when she wasn't around. I contacted his personal attorney, a man named Mr. Fielding who had handled his affairs for over 20 years, and whose number I found on a document in the drawer. Mr. Alderman pointed me to one afternoon while Renee was out. I called from my personal cell, outside in the garden, well away from the house. I told him what I'd heard, what I'd seen, what I suspected about the medication adjustments. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line. Then he said he'd had concerns of his own and had been waiting for someone on the inside to reach out. He sent a pharmacist contact, someone Mr. Fielding trusted personally, who came to the house under the pretense of delivering a prescription refill. We spent 20 minutes in Mr. Alderman's room while I described what had been happening, what the schedule of specialist visits looked like, what his behavior patterns were before and after. The pharmacist took notes and asked careful questions. 2 weeks later, Mr. Fielding told me there was enough to act on. The medication Mr. Alderman had been receiving from the so-called specialist was not appropriate for his documented diagnosis. The dosage had been altered in a way that would produce exactly the symptoms Renee had been bringing in evaluators to document. The next step was the hardest part. We had to wait a little longer. Mr. Alderman had to not show improvement too early, or Renee would become suspicious and change tactics. So for another 3 weeks, he kept playing the role. He threw things when she visited. He called her by the wrong name. He refused meals and had to be coaxed and made a scene when new staff came to the door. Renee watched all of it with the practiced calm of someone who had already decided the outcome and was just waiting for the paperwork. Derek would sometimes stand in the doorway while these episodes happened, and I would be there looking overwhelmed and helpless, which was very much a performance. Once he looked at me after a particularly theatrical moment and said, "You're good at this job." I said, "Thank you," and looked appropriately tired. The meeting was Renee's idea. She announced it on a Tuesday, and the energy in the house that week was charged. She had her posture back. She was making calls and sending emails and ordering things to be prepared in the formal dining room. Derek spent a lot of time on the phone, and the few times I passed him, he looked like a man on the verge of something he'd been looking forward to. The morning of the meeting, I helped Mr. Alderman get dressed. He chose the dark grey suit he'd been saving since I arrived. He looked better than I'd seen him look in all the weeks I'd been there. "Ready?" I said. He straightened his jacket. More than ready. The dining room was full when we arrived. Renee had assembled his doctors, 2 attorneys who worked for the estate, and 3 members of the board of his primary holding company. She stood at the head of the table in a pale green blazer, Derek seated to her right. She presented her case calmly. Her father's deterioration, his inability to make sound decisions, the danger he posed to himself and others. She cited dates, incident reports, the records from the specialist visits. She was organized. She was composed. She was very convincing. One of the board members glanced over at Mr. Bat, Alderman, who was sitting in his wheelchair near the end of the table. He looked frail, still, eyes slightly unfocused. Then Renee said it was time to formally petition for legal conservatorship, at which point all authority over the estate, assets, and medical decisions would transfer to her. Derek leaned back in his chair with his hands folded and a small smile on his face. Mr. Alderman moved. Not with the jerky agitation of a man losing control, he sat up, straightened his spine, set both hands flat on the table in front of him, and looked at his daughter with the clear-eyed steadiness of someone who had been waiting a long time for this exact moment. "I think," he said, "we should hear from my attorney first." Renee's expression didn't shift immediately, but I saw her jaw tighten. Mr. Fielding was already standing. He thanked the room and opened a folder. He spoke methodically about the medication irregularities, about the altered dosages, about the documentation his team had assembled over the past several weeks. He set copies in front of each person at the table. One of Renee's attorneys started to object. Mr. Fielding continued, and when he was done, he referenced a recording. That was the part that changed the room. The recording was from a conversation in the study, Renee's voice and Derek's clear as a phone call. He will keep getting worse. And then, everything goes to me. Derek's smile disappeared so completely, it was like it had never been there. Renee stood up from her chair. She started speaking quickly and then louder, and one of the board members said something sharp to her, and she stopped. And the room went very quiet. The two estate attorneys were already consulting with each other in low voices. One of the board members was on his phone. The doctor who had signed off on the behavior assessments was staring at the folder in front of him without picking it up. Two police officers, who Mr. Fielding had arranged to be standing by, were brought into the room. I watched Derek's face while they were being escorted out. He looked at me once, right before he reached the door. It wasn't a look I could fully read. Not angry exactly, something more confused. Like he couldn't reconcile the woman who had needed this job with the one who had just been in the room while his plan came apart. I didn't look away. After they were gone, the room was different, quieter. The board members were talking with Mr. Fielding. One of the legitimate doctors was making notes. The hum of something orderly replacing something that had been wrong for a long time. Mr. Alderman turned his wheelchair slowly until he was facing me. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me for a long moment, and his eyes were tired but clear. "You came here because you needed work," he said. "I did," I said. "And you stayed when you could have walked away." I thought about that night in the hallway, my palms flat against the wall, the counting breathing. The moment I could have gone upstairs and done nothing. "I have a son," I said. "I've been trying to make sure he knows that people don't look away when something is wrong. That's harder to teach if you don't actually do it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Mr. Fielding. "The documents we discussed," he said. "Mr. Documents." Fielding nodded and slid a folder across the table toward me. I didn't understand at first. I looked down at it and then up at Mr. Alderman. He said, "I have properties in this city that have sat empty because I never decided what to do with them. I have an investment account that has no beneficiary because my estate planning has been neglected for the past 2 years while I was being slowly made to look incompetent." He paused. "I'd like to correct some of that." I shook my head. "That's not why I helped you." "I know," he said. "That's exactly why. I called my mother that night from the garden." Eli answered. He told me Gerald the roly-poly bug had gotten a friend who he'd named Gerald too. I laughed. I cried a little. Not much, just enough. A few months earlier, I had driven away from my mother's house with a broke tank of gas and a phone full of unanswered job listings. And I had walked into that house because I had no other choice. And now Eli was coming home to a place that was actually ours, and his dad was facing fraud charges in Davidson County, and an old man in Brentwood was sleeping soundly for the first time in months. Not because I set out to fix anything, not because I wanted revenge or a reward. Sometimes you just refuse to look the other way. And sometimes, against all odds, that turns out to be enough. I keep thinking about the moment I stood in that hallway with my palms flat against the wall, listening to Renee and Derek talk about destroying a man's mind for money. And I think about how easy it would have been to just keep walking, to tell myself it wasn't my problem, to protect the job, stay quiet, let someone else figure it out. Nobody would have blamed me. I was a broke single mom on her last $100. I had every practical reason in the world to look the other way. But here's what I've come to understand. The choices we make when we have the least to spare are the ones that actually define us, not the easy ones, not the ones where doing right costs us nothing, the ones that feel like they might cost us everything. What Derek never understood in 11 years of marriage or after is that character isn't something you perform when people are watching. Mr. Alderman figured out I'd heard something before I said a word because he'd spent 50 years reading people. He saw it in the way I looked at him. And what he saw was someone who had already decided. That decision didn't come from strategy. It came from something deeper, the simple refusal to participate in something wrong just because it was inconvenient to resist. That's what I want Eli to grow up knowing. Not a lesson I lecture him about, but one he absorbs from watching how I move through the world. That your integrity isn't the thing you save for important moments. It's the accumulation of every small moment where you chose honesty over comfort, action over silence, someone else's dignity over your own convenience. And I want him to understand that caring about doing right is not enough on its own. You have to think clearly. You have to be smart about how you act on what you believe. When I heard that conversation in the study, emotion alone would have gotten me fired, and Mr. Alderman would have lost everything. What mattered was slowing down, making a plan, contacting Mr. Fielding, being careful about timing. Love and principle without clear thinking is just noise. The two have to work together. But none of it means anything without the third thing, the staying, the showing up on day 2 and day 5 and day 19 when it would have been so much easier to quit. When Derek made his comments, and Renee looked through me and the whole house felt designed to remind me of my place in it. Perseverance isn't dramatic. It mostly looks like getting up and doing the same hard thing again, quietly, without applause. I didn't set out to save anyone. I set out to pay my electric bill and keep my son in school. But I've learned that when you show up with the right intentions and you stay sharp and you refuse to give up, life has a way of rearranging itself around that. Eli came home. That's the part that matters most to me. He named a roly-poly bug Gerald and then founded a friend named Gerald too, and someday I'll tell him the full story of that house in Brentwood. And I hope what he hears is not that his mom got lucky. I hope he hears that she didn't look away and that it was worth it.